No worries here. Now, okay.
I'm so small there.
No, you remain only in the camera. I have no necessity to talk anything. What do you think about Syria? What is the solution for Syria?
There is a solution. Syria is done.
It's done.
I mean, so is Lebanon, but Syria more.
Okay.
Syria is no longer a country.
What will be the
I think it will stay broken like this for a very long time. I mean, the region as a whole. I'm saying like Turkey is barely holding. Its borders like Hatay. I mean, Hatay, this is Syria. This is it's the Levant. It does belong to Turkey. It was annexed. It was given by the French to Ataturk. Right, this is historical Syria. When you go there, you go in the street. You're like, okay, this is Syria. The looks, the faces, the buildings, the food, the smells. You know, it's another country.
Okay. And the vision. There are some vision of Hezbollah about the future of Syria. What seems Hezbollah
hard to tell what they think. I mean, once upon a time, they had this idea to liberate Jerusalem. Now I think they they liberate Jerusalem via Baghdad, via Tehran, via Manama.
And the decline domination of Syria was strongly related with the crisis of Lebanon.
Yeah. I mean, in different levels. Lebanon was always a bit more, it held together a bit better because it's a small area.
It's possible to Syria without Bashar al-Assad?
No.
Bashar al-Assad will remain here all the time if he wants.
I mean, if he's taken down, it will be much worse. Much worse.
What are the forces in fight in Syria?
There is the Islamist
absolutely
Islamic State, secular. There is Israel. There is Turkey. There is France, America. There is Iraq. There is Saudi Arabia, Iran. That's not simple.
What is the purpose of Iran in this conflict in all this area?
They want to be the leaders. They want to be the leaders of the Middle East. They want to be the leaders of Islam, of the Muslim world.
And this situation between Iran and Saudi Arabia
are enemies.
Hi, I asked you to go to the camera. We have a guest that will talk with us about the conflict of the Middle East, and it's the time to do a really open conversation. And as you see, you have a lot of videos that I upload today about the theory that needs to work today. Okay, Ari, the people arriving. Thank you for your presence here. Ari presents himself, and he has a really interesting roots, Colombian, but also Judy's Greek roots, and you live a lot of time in the Middle East, and you have a really interesting vision of the conflict of your area. And you have also this possibility to talk us about your vision of the conflict in relationship of our country. Thank you for your assistance, and you have time and the possibility to ask all you want. I asking you to power on your camera because it's better when I have we are have guests. Okay, begin.
Okay. All right. So good evening. I'm here in Istanbul. My name is Ayman Ackermans. I'm a writer with background in philosophy and classics. I lived in Istanbul for quite a long time, almost a decade. And I have a Middle Eastern background. I've been in the region for a very long time, since the beginning of the 2000s, and living in different corners of it, though for the most part here in Istanbul. We had a number of conversations with Leonardo here in Istanbul this week about the Middle East generally, which is a gigantic topic. And I was thinking that as we are facing this extended pandemic season, to put it that way, there is this concept that is revolving around our heads all the time. We hear it in the media and in casual conversations, which is the apocalypse. and what's the apocalypse, and what does it mean in this context of the Middle East? So I want to talk about a small country on the Mediterranean, which is Lebanon. A place that, to call it interesting would be an understatement. And I'm always convinced that the word interesting has no semantic value. It's an empty concept. I would say that Lebanon is a place which is both complex and complicated. It is a very small state founded in the 1920s as a haven for Middle Eastern Christians. That was kind of the idea. It didn't exactly work like that. It was a country basically created by the French, and then it became independent. It was built on an Ottoman template in which everything is divided. All power is shared between religious communities, of which there are 18 in Lebanon. So you're talking about, like, okay, when you say Muslims and Christians, this isn't that definition fine-tuned enough. You're talking about what kind of Muslims, what kinds of Christians, and Christians not as in Catholics and Protestants, but Greek Catholics, Greek Orthodox, Armenian Evangelical, Armenian Orthodox, Greek Melkites, which are Arabic-speaking Greek Catholics, offshoot from the Greek Orthodoxy that didn't want to comply with the ecumenical patriarchate of Constantinople. So I'm saying it's a political cosmology of its own. And this country, which is basically a very promising, I would say, oasis in the Middle East. It was a very wealthy country sitting on the most beautiful shores of the Mediterranean, with this very widely multicultural society. It was a multilingual country, with lots of material and cultural wealth. And the experiment didn't last very long. After Lebanon became independent in 1943.
Could you explain more about the experiment of the integration of these different ethnic groups?
So I'm saying, yeah, this is where I'm going. So after Lebanon became an independent country in 1943, the sharing of power was always very unbalanced, because as it was structurally built to be a sort of Christian country, with this absurd balance of shared powers, in which the prime minister is a Sunni, the president is a Christian, the speaker of the parliament is a Shia Muslim. Of course, many people were excluded, many Christians were excluded. All the positions in government were allocated to quotas by religious group. If people were going to vote, so there were like 18 different booths, like every religion will vote in a different booth. And then you're thinking, like, okay, how is this going to work? Somehow it worked, because it inherited this, I would say, like this side-by-side convivence of the Ottoman world. By side, it doesn't live together. It means we live in different towns, we live in different cities, we run our affairs independently. It was not going to work out anyway, okay, but it worked for a shorter period than it was meant to be, because there is a major event in the middle, which is the creation of the State of Israel. and the exodus of Palestinians.
Could you explain more about the situation in Midwest? What was the first problem of that?
Well, I mean, the state of Israel was created, and then this created an entire generation of stateless people that went all over the region and all over the world. This is particularly acute in Lebanon because, I mean, their numbers were gigantic. They flocked into the country. This changed the demographic balance, and the demographic balance is everything in Lebanon. The demographic balance is the cultural balance, the political balance, the religious balance. So you have all these Sunni Muslims that come to the country. There is militia, there is war, there is the resistance. You have to fight against Israel. Anyway, conflict starts, and then it kind of bifurcates, and it goes on, it comes down, it goes up, it goes down. And eventually, Lebanon erupts into a civil war in 1975, a war that lasted, this war ended in 1990. But the thing is that the war didn't really start in 1975, and it didn't really end in 1990. This war really started in the 1860s.
Okay, so
long before Lebanon was a country. I mean, there was the clashes between the Kurds, between the Druze and the Maronites in the mountains of Lebanon. And one of the power tricks that the Ottomans played in the Levant especially, it was pitting communities against each other. It was divide and rule.
Perhaps we need to know more about the connection with the identity of Lebanon and the history of San Maron. What is the paper of Maron?
Fundamentally, San Maron was, I mean, he wasn't Lebanese. He was a Syrian guy. He was a saint. He was a medieval saint who was, I mean, well integrated into the Latin Rite, I mean, the Oriental Latin Rite of the Catholic Church. And his followers are called Maronites, which are technically Catholics. I mean, now Arabic speaking, but because they were like Aramaic speaking once upon a time. I mean, it is a sect, or I wouldn't say, I wouldn't call it even a sect. It's a small group inside Roman Catholicism. And that is, I would say, like the major Christian denomination of Lebanon. Though its origins are in Syria, and what you have to know about how these religious communities ended up in Lebanon is that Lebanon, in a way, it was this place where many people fled to Lebanon from religious persecution. So it's like the way the Druze arrived in Lebanon, the way that many of the Sunnis arrived in Lebanon, they were being persecuted somewhere else. I mean, so did the Armenians in the 20th century, so did the Greek Orthodox in the 20th century. So I'm saying this was a sort of a utopian setup.
Right.
And what we know about utopian setups is that they usually end in disappointment.
Okay. Let me another utopic situation. Les he pedido que por favor enciendan la cámara cuando tenemos invitados. Me gustaría que aquellos que puedan hacerlo lo hagan porque estamos viendo unas pantallas negras. Entonces sería bueno que aquellos que lo puedan hacer lo hagan y vamos a continuar la conversación y por supuesto háganos las preguntas en directo. Háganos las preguntas en directo porque recuerden que estamos estoy en el iPad, entonces no alcanzo a ver no olvidé el nombre. El chat. Okay, thank you. We'll continue about this.
And so we're talking about the utopian setups. They tend to be a scenario of disappointment. And then it's like, I mean, as my teacher Agnes Herro, I've talked to you a lot about, was a Hungarian philosopher. She asked in one of the essays that she wrote maybe 2-3 years before her death in 2019, she was saying, she's asking this question of, are revolutions betrayed? Can a revolution be betrayed? And then she asked, I mean, the answer is actually very interesting for this concept because she says, only a revolution that was successful can be betrayed. A failed revolution cannot be betrayed because it failed anyway. So I'm saying this semi-utopian project of Lebanon, it failed, but I'm saying like, you can't accuse of failure something which was not trying to succeed.
So, a bit more about that.
I'm saying it was very difficult for Lebanese to aim to succeed when they didn't constitute themselves as a nation. Lebanon was more of a federation of hostile tribes, and then turned into a state which happened to sit in a very privileged site, in a very privileged location with all this history and all these resources. And then I'm saying, like, this is going backwards. So I'm saying, okay, so we locate the beginnings of the Lebanese wars in the middle of the 19th century. Then forward, you see that the war ended in 1990. Well, I mean, the war continued under different names. The militia leaders became the political leaders of the country. Israel invaded in 2006. Hezbollah defended the country. The resistance defended the country. The south of the country was flattened, and all these enmities and hostilities between these different factions. I mean, they continued, and they continue to this day. Now they cannot go to war because nobody. I mean, there is no money, there is no electricity, there is no water pressure in the buildings. So it's hard to wage a war like that. But I think that in the contemporary world, we have to be faced with the situation that the model of warfare has changed, and wars are no longer what they used to be. I'm saying, like, Derrida has this idea, and he has this book about Carl Schmitt called The Politics of Friendship, when he says the most inhuman and violent war is the war without war. Like the war that is not on a battlefield.
Okay.
But it's a social, economic, cultural, ideological war. And I'm pretty convinced that many of the wars that many, I wouldn't call it even countries, that many entities are fighting today are of this kind, like these wars from far away. For example, think about the concept of the refugee camps.
Okay.
Of people fleeing from danger and then being trapped on these Greek islands without access to water, without access to the internet, without access to telephones. So they are trapped in this different time zone, which is not the time zone of modernity. It's like a pre-modern time. I mean, this is a type of violence so reckless that in a way it's worse than the violence of war, of traditional war. And so placing this back on the context of Lebanon, these wars between different factions, they took different I wouldn't say they put on different masks. The mask of ideology, the mask of economy, the mask of urban planning,
okay,
the mask of environmental disaster, the mask of economic blockades. I mean, the tense relationship between Lebanon and Israel, and the occupation of, Syria occupied Lebanon for an extended period of time. This occupation ended only in 2005, when there was this Cedar Revolution. And this was probably the largest protest in the history of Lebanon. And actually, this is from where the term the Arab Spring comes from.
Okay.
When the Bush administration termed this protest in Lebanon the Arab Spring, but it was more like a long winter.
Okay. Could you explain more about your vision of Arab Spring? Arab Spring do something?
I think that this isn't necessarily about. I think that the question here is not about what the Arab Spring did or didn't. Generally speaking, I would say that for people in the region, this was the most important event in our lives. If you're someone in your 20s and in your 30s, that defined everything as it was to come later, mostly for the wars. But let's say in a more general analytical perspective, the limits of the Arab Spring are not the limits of the Arab Spring. They are not the limits of Arabs. They are the limits of our times. They are the limits of our history, in the sense of, like, all the revolutions of the 20th century were not only utopian, but they were also nostalgic, meaning they were patterned on earlier revolutions that had failed. And when you come to the Arab Spring, the political imaginary had depleted all its fuel. Especially after this grand era of optimism, which I would say is the 1990s, the era of European multiculturalism, and it says like it's like leaving the solid and rigid project of modernity behind and walking into this whole new world in which there were no borders, and then there is a Treaty of Maastricht, and people could travel anywhere. Of course, it was the people who could travel anywhere. We were talking about 100 million people.
No,
it wasn't everybody, and everybody else was not living in the era of optimism. Actually, was living in a world where the borders became tighter and tighter and tighter. So the failure of the Arab Spring to materialize any gains are indicative of the failure of social movements generally in our times to materialize any gains.
Do you have another example of that?
I'm saying, think about Occupy Wall Street.
Okay.
this is major, but I'm also thinking of like which Latin American country has not had protest movements, like massive protest movements in the last 50 years. I mean, I cannot think of one. I mean, think about the Chavista revolution as a protest movement. I mean, did they succeed? Unfortunately, yes. So I'm saying that you're hitting this glass ceiling of history of I mean, what is the meaning of revolutions? And then Agnes Heller, who was one of the most prominent Marxists of the 20th century, she had a shift of position towards the 80s, and I mean, mostly based on rereading Hegel and Kierkegaard. And then she was saying, we cannot change everyday life. I'm saying we cannot change the world. We can only change ourselves. Okay. I'm saying, and this is it is a very nice position. It has a number of political inclinations. It's rich it's rich not in politics, but in the political, like in the political aspect of who we are as political beings. But this, of course, it's not a solution. And when you think about it, one of the greatest successes of capitalism, I would say, in its most let's say contemporary neoliberal form. I'm saying this is something that was said to me by an art collector in Iran, which I thought was a brilliant thing. And she said to me, the greatest success of capitalism is that it has this uncanny ability to transform the critique of capitalism into pop culture.
Explain about that.
So
about that, seeing from here, from Tehran.
I'm saying what's transforming the critique of capitalism into pop culture. There is the Gezi Park protests in 2013 and 30, massive uprising, which changed the political life of this country. I mean, it changed our lives forever. We're still living on the mostly negative consequences of the state reaction to these protests. And what's pop culture is that there was the Joker masks, for example, were a symbol of the protests, and also penguins were a symbol of the protests, because as the protests were taking place and protesters were being tear gassed in downtown Istanbul, the state channels were showing a documentary about penguins. So penguins became this icon. And what's the pop culture? 6 months after the Gezi Park protest, the art exhibitions already had paintings with the masks and the penguins. Okay. So I'm saying this transformation of these political symbols into objects of consumption is almost immediate. And then you say things that were needed in the protest, for example, these masks. So the protest had not been taking place for 3 days. There were already street sellers selling the masks. So I'm saying we are in a crazy situation in which our economic system is in a way depleted and not depleted. And I will try to explain what I mean. It's like capitalism generally relies on the infinite production of value. I mean, it's a completely abstract system. The problem is that the earth is not infinite. Its resources are finite. So now that modernity in this variant of reckless capitalism has covered the entire planet, it has to begin eating its own institutions. It has to begin eating its own culture. It has to cannibalize itself, because I mean it has to. It's an like it's value abstraction. It has to continue producing value on value.
You talk perhaps really fast about the protest in Taksim Square. Could you talk more in a sense about this, the sense of the protest?
Well, I mean,
it's only Islamic situation. It's only
actually the Gezi Park protest. It was a revolution which was not really meant to be. In fact, it was a protest of some young environmentalists against cutting of the trees on the park next to Taksim Square to build the shopping mall. That's how it starts. And then the government reaction was so brutal, so violent. I'm saying like tear gas was flying down Istiklal Street for 72 hours nonstop. Many people were injured. A number of like teenagers were killed. It was extremely violent.
Is it possible to talk about that here?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's commonplace.
Okay.
And then, in the face of this violence, these protests grew bigger and bigger, and more people started to join. And then, many segments of society took part in it. And then the protests spread throughout the country, and they lasted for about 6 months. I mean, they literally led nowhere. They transformed the country in the sense of the regime became more paranoid than ever.
Okay.
Restrictions fell down on the press, on LGBT. The gay pride parade was canceled. Censorship of the media became more and more strict. Censorship of universities, censorship of public events. Anyway, it transformed the ecosystem, the political ecosystem of the country forever. But I think it's hard to. I mean, when people say like nothing came out of the Gezi protests, I mean, I think it's a mistaken, it's a really misleading assessment, because I think it gave people the opportunity to realize where they are.
Okay.
And this violence, which was encountered by the middle class, by the Istanbul middle class, is something that they had never experienced. However, this is the everyday life of Eastern Turkey. This is the everyday life in parts held by Kurds, and it's the modus operandi of the state regularly. So now it came to the big city, and people were like, "Oh, okay, so this is the Turkish state." And you could say that this is a bit of a depressing state of affairs, but it is what it is. It leveled the ground, and it said, "Okay, we are all living in the same country." Generally, I guess that these protest movements, they create seeds for something else, and I think it's important to not look at them only through the lens of nostalgia. There is this Turkish sociologist Cihan Erdal, who was in prison. I mean, he was in prison for maybe 6 months. He was released actually quite recently, who developed this concept about the politics of ghosts. I think like how these revolutions feed on each other. And they were talking about, for example, the fall of the Pinochet era constitution,
okay,
which has been, and it has been within an echo chamber system of many protests, and I'm saying that the Chilean protests have been in the background of many protests in many places. So I'm saying this process is not straightforward, it's not ideological, it's not transparent. But something remains there. And I guess that there is something that remains from the spirit of Gezi in the, I'm saying, in the opposition political culture in Turkey, and it is that people are more aware of what's going on.
Okay. Do you think the political position of the young people in the Arab world has similarities with our positions? Our young people in Latin America, or there are nothing in common?
I mean, I think, well, this is a very, I mean, it's almost an impossible comparison. I guess that the experience of what colonialism means in both places is, radically different. Latin Americans were colonized very early. I mean, they were not colonized, they were conquered. Yeah. Or always Latin America was created by this conquest. There was no such a thing as Latin America. It was pre-Columbian settlements. And this conquest and process of conquest and colonization lasted for so long that it brought the Americas under the, I'm saying like the Americas is a part of the Western world. So I'm saying like they are, I mean, it's they are Christians, they speak Spanish, and at least in the South. North Americans, they're white, they are Anglo-Saxons, they are largely Protestants, they speak English, etc., etc. When colonization arrived in the Middle East, it was much later. It was in the 19th century. So, for example, they didn't teach the language in the same way. They didn't convert people, and the rulers of Middle Eastern, I wouldn't call it countries, of the Middle Eastern entities, particularly the Ottoman Empire, they were themselves powerful. They were themselves wealthy. They had centuries of relations with Europe. There are many marriages between the Ottoman royal, the royal court, and European nobility houses. So in a way, the memory of colonialism is more fresh. I mean, it's fresher for Arabs, but the process of colonization that took place in Latin America is incomparably deeper. So you cannot say, I mean, I don't think that Arabs would consider themselves Europeans in the way that Latin America, I mean, okay, Latin Americans are not Europeans. I mean, we would say that today, but they are a part of the Western world. I mean, they take part in the logic of Western capitalism. The institutions are Western, the educational institutions are Western. And in a way, the logic of life, it's relatively Westernized. Here, as you can see, it's a completely different thing. You are like, I mean, here, some institutions may be Westernized, although, but life is very Eastern.
Yes.
And
let me see if perhaps you have any questions. Let me see if it is perhaps it's something in the chat. Okay. Okay. Do you have any questions? Any interactions? Or we could continue to talk in my house like a meeting. Okay.
So I think that the thing that connects the Latin American protest movements and the Arab ones actually is the Soviet Union.
Okay, tell me about it.
I'm saying this is the Cold War, that in which the Soviet Union was supportive of any anti-imperialist movements all over the world, even if they were tyrannical ones. And we could say, as we have seen in Latin America, that there is left tyranny. Though I would say the standard model of Latin American tyranny is a right-wing one supported by the United States, of course. But I mean, I think that this legacy of the Cold War is it is the thing that I'm saying this internationalism and this third worldism,
Okay.
sponsored by the Soviet Union. I mean, it wasn't for free. It wasn't something so harmless.
Yeah.
Hey, I think that this spirit of this classic Soviet leftism is still alive in Latin America as much as in the Arab world. But the world has changed. And what you can see in Colombia or in Latin America is that there is very little difference between policies among right and left parties.
Yes.
In the Arab world, it's difficult to really grasp this because there have never been left parties in power. Unless it's been to revolutionary means. I mean, you could say, for example, that the Ba'ath Party, which is the former ruling party of Iraq and the current ruling party of Syria, are leftists. But I mean, I'm saying like I mean, in their inception, like their fundamental impetus is this Soviet leftist internationalism. But then again, you can be the Syrian regime, and you can bring a prison laced Naya and torture hundreds of thousands. So I think, I mean, in the end of the day, Hannah Arendt, she writes in The Origins of Totalitarianism that already by the end of the 19th century, the categories of liberal and conservative were dead.
Yeah.
They didn't necessarily have the strong ideological associations. And today, I mean, you ask this question of like, I mean, what's the role of ideology? You can say like, I mean, is the Democratic Party ideological? Is the Republican Party ideological? And I'm skeptical about the presence of ideology. And I think this is when, I mean, I think this is the thing that will reconnect to what I was saying in the beginning about when I mean, what do we mean when we talk about the apocalypse?
Okay.
And so we say the apocalypse, I mean, if you look at this philologically, so the apocalypse is not the event, it's the announcement of the event. And so in our case, when our apocalypse happened, I mean, when it was announced, it had already happened.
Okay.
So maybe this is an apocalypse. And in any case, the predicament of the apocalypse as an event is saying, okay, this is the end of the world. But this is the thing: the world doesn't end because the world is not a thing. The world is an aggregate of relationships. I mean, the world is this intersubjective space that we create by being together in the world, by speaking to each other, by living together, whether we like each other or not. It doesn't matter. It is still a form of worldliness. And there is this sort of, I mean, what we call the apocalypse now, it's an ongoing, interminable apocalypse.
Okay.
Apocalypse without end. And this is it's an economic apocalypse. What's the economic apocalypse? Is you go to there is the wealthy people and you say, look, things are bad. The poor are gonna come and they're gonna take your money. And then you go to the poor, look, things are bad, the rich have your money. And it goes on. This narrative continues. And so this apocalyptic imaginary of now, it is not even the end of the world. It's actually a fixation on the present. The idea that nothing exists but the present. And so the way out of the apocalypse, you would think, at least in terms of a political imaginary, of the political imagination, is one of the things that makes us very different from I'm saying from the people of modernity. I mean, we are still kind of the people of modernity, but I'm saying from the peoples of the 20th century, is that they say, okay, so we have this project, we're going to create this human world, a world without cats, and we're going to rule over nature, and we're going to create these institutions, we're going to build these tall buildings, we're going to use lots of steel, and we are going to pollute a lot. Because it's a lot of fun to make human beings.
these people had an idea that this project will have a future.
Okay.
And that when we get to this future, things will be super fun. We are those people in that future. And it's not that fun. But I'm saying this is a quantitative difference. The real qualitative difference is that because we are living in the future of modernity, we have no ability to imagine any kind of future different than the present.
Okay.
Like our idea of the future is a time exactly like our own or worse. And so there comes this sort of this blackmail of this economic apocalypse of saying, okay, you have to stop producing coal. They say, okay, but how are you know, people are going to starve. They're starving already. And so there is this, and Susan Sontag, for example, was always warning about ecofascism, which is a really interesting concept. I mean, she was talking about this in the 70s. And he was saying is like this emphasis that, okay, we have to stop everything because we have to save the planet. And we have to end capitalism, whatever that means. But it actually turns out that is only a part of a potential solution. I'm saying you cannot have, you can have a planet, but the planet is not the world. A planet is not society. I'm not saying the planet the planet is the only thing that we have in the end of the day, but it tends to be more complicated than that. And when people say, okay, this is the cultural critique of the day of our times is capitalism has to come to an end. But you have to narrow it down to say, like, what is capitalism here? So capitalism is not one thing. Capitalism is this galaxy of many different phenomena. So there is a part of capitalism that it begins when the Bank of England started printing money. There is one beginning there. So this is one phenomenon within capitalism. There is another beginning, which is the Dutch stock market in the 17th century. There is another beginning, is insurance companies in the 15th, 16th century in Germany. But there is other beginnings like barter in the Neolithic. There is another beginning with the rise of agriculture in Neolithic Anatolia. There is and how are you going to end all of these things at the same time?
Yes.
I'm curious. Some of these things are institutional. Let's say like the Bank of England printing money. Okay, we can stop printing money. But that's not going to end capitalism as a whole, because there are some aspects of capitalism that are actually part of our anthropological cultures. They are part of our genetic social memory. That some things are exchanged for other things. And actually, like David Graeber, who was a brilliant anthropologist, who wrote a book, like a decade ago, called Debt, the First 5,000 Years. So he writes a book about the history of debt rather than the history of money. And he talks about faculty of promise. So I promise you that I'm going to do such and such. Arendt would say that promises is this thing that keeps the human world together because it gives certain predictability to a completely unpredictable world. Gregory, he takes this even farther and he says, actually, the thing that money hasn't been there since forever. And barter actually is not a thing. I'm saying el trueque has never really existed. It's not really anthropologically documented in any societies. It existed on a limited scale, probably on a ritual scale, things that had to do with marriages and certain traditions between societies. The thing that existed was actually credit. The promise of saying, okay, you are gonna work for me, and in exchange, I'm gonna give you this amount of wheat. And then you're gonna go to a kind of a market and you're gonna say, I earned this amount of wheat, so I am gonna take some fruits from you and I will pay you in wheat later. So I'm saying, so this structure is so inherently anthropological that it cannot be erased when it doesn't end by not printing money. And so you say like, okay, so there is the apocalypse, it doesn't end. We cannot end. So we have to reimagine the future, a future which is different than our own. And I think this is the place where we're really stuck. Because, I mean, there is critical theories, some things, there is some really interesting philosophers that talk about, I mean, a possibility of another world, and I guess, and we have to envision another world, because I mean, like we are really, I mean, we are in real bad shape.
Could you do the link between us, this discourse, and the actual situation in Lebanon and in Syria?
I'm saying, I think that Syria and Lebanon, they are countries from the future.
Okay, more about
that. These are warnings from the future of saying what happens.
Okay, you said what, like warnings?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm saying what happens when your banking system collapses because somebody stole the money. And I'm saying this is not so far-fetched. What I'm trying to say is this thing that happened to Lebanon, I mean, it happened in such a dramatic way because it is a very small country that has been heavily under sanctions, or individual actors have been under sanctions. But if you look at the numbers, the percentages of reserves of Latin American countries are very small.
Yeah,
like the collapse of banking systems is around the corner for many of these countries. Now, there are these global institutions, of these powerful institutions, and I wouldn't even say, I'm not even talking about the World Bank and so on. I'm talking about like the Treasury.
Okay. Okay.
These are the real powers. That these are the horses of the apocalypse. I'm saying like they can ride it back and forth, and all of these miserable countries that are somewhere between purgatorium and hell all the time had always this assurance that they will survive and that their political elites will survive, because you will always have the treasure.
Okay, but explain me with Syria. Bashar al-Assad is in the power.
I would say, so
Okay.
I'm saying, do you have this assurance that the US dollar is
Yes.
going to be worth a certain amount and it's going to be, but many things have changed. Like now the US dollar is not backed by gold anymore. And the US is not exactly a paragon of stability. And with a very small flip, with a very small sliding out, it can take down the entire Latin American banking system.
Yeah.
And what happened when their banking system collapses is that that you have no money. and when you have no money, it's really complicated because it's not like you can't live. Like you can live biologically. And so there is no electricity, there is no water pressure. Some people have money. There is $1 rate in the banks, another dollar rate in the streets, which is like 15 times higher.
Perhaps we need a more broad explanation about the life now in Beirut.
I mean,
what is the collapse in Beirut?
I'm saying you go to the pharmacy opens only a few hours a day because they don't have things. Things are running out in the supermarket. Butter costs $10, but the minimum wage is $30. And so you need dollars from abroad. You need dollars from your relatives in Canada, in Colombia, in Brazil, in Turkey, in England. But can you build, and I mean, can you really build a country on Western Union orders? I mean, okay, you can, for how long? And I mean, services are not being provided. Hospitals are, I mean, they have electricity blackouts, so they have to disconnect COVID patients, or they have to see which COVID patient is more valuable than other patients.
But this is not a history of the last 20 years in Syria.
No, I'm saying like, I mean, actually Syria is holding a little better.
Oh my gosh.
In terms of infrastructure. Financially, no, because basically since the beginning of the war in Syria, Western powers have placed sanctions heavy sanctions on Syrian financial institutions. So what Syrians did is they put their money in Beirut. They drove to Beirut on the weekend, they did their shopping, took money from the bank in bags of money, and took it back to Syria. And then the Lebanese banks closed their doors and said, we have no money. And so this effectively collapsed Syria as well, but not to the same degree. There is still electricity in Syria. I'm saying I mean, I know that this sounds so exaggerated, but really there is no electricity. Like if you are wealthy and you can pay for a generator. So in the past, I would say like 3 years ago, this generator will give you 20 to 24 hours of electricity every day. Now, if you are wealthy and you can pay the generator, it gives you 4 hours. And it costs as much as the rent.
Okay.
If you're not wealthy, you get maybe 1 hour. So in this 1 hour, you have to charge your iPhone, you have to charge the wireless modem, you have to wash your clothes, you have to iron, you have to put things in the freezer, you have to charge a computer, and it's like you cannot use the vacuum cleaner and the fridge at the same time.
So hold on, okay.
So I was like, okay, so today you freeze the chicken for an hour so it doesn't go rotten. Tomorrow you vacuum clean. Yeah, and so I'm saying this is an Angat is an otherworldly experience. And I think once upon a time we had this conversation with you about when we talk about the sea peoples.
Okay.
So there is,
Talk about the sea peoples.
I mean, the sea peoples is this fictional entity that we think that they collapsed the world of the Bronze Age, which is around the 2000 BC. Suddenly, all of these civilizations disappeared in Anatolia, in Greece, in Egypt, the entire Levant. And with them, languages disappeared, writing disappeared. I mean, how can writing disappear? It disappeared. It had to be reinvented somehow. It brought these dark ages that lasted a few hundred years, when people were actually quite nomadic. There was no intensive agriculture. Those were really some dark times. Eventually, at the end of these dark times, you had, for example, classical Greece was born, of archaic Greece that gave birth to classical Greece was born at the end of this period. But the Bronze Age generally was actually a fairly advanced period for our standards. They had massive trade networks and systems of communication. Diplomacy was very active. People were well educated. I mean, for those times, like women were not educated, and we're talking about the 2000 BC.
Yeah.
There were constitutions, there were laws, there were educational institutions, there were libraries, and especially the trade networks were very advanced. And the financial system was actually very advanced. So this is a dynamic system in the sense of it has many interconnecting dots. Like the very complex interrelations between agriculture, money, diplomacy, soft power, military power. And these interrelations began to break. It was just minor things. But these minor things, it was a loop system. These minor things broke other things, and they broke other things, and they broke other things. So sometimes it just makes scholars think maybe the sea people didn't do this. And somehow, so it's just like and this is the paradox of modernity, which is also the paradox of the Bronze Age. The more complex societies are, the more fragile they are.
Okay.
And so we have the coronavirus. We know about this fragility. Halt air travel and see what happens. And I mean, it was catastrophic. Not only on a macro and on a micro scale. Mobility was a thing so taken for granted. And the thing is the virus is not done, but there are vaccines and things are moving on, but we are nowhere near where we were. And we may not be for an entire generation. So it says so this very complex interconnected world that we live in is actually very fragile. And so it goes back to this idea of when we say about ending capitalism. All these capitalist relations are embedded in a lot of these very dynamic interconnected systems of this. It's like these multipolar relations. And these systems are, I mean, again, so dynamic and so fragile at the same time that if you collapse this whole thing, I don't know, you will have to grow potatoes in the sink.
But the Zoom communications and all that is not the penguin city, the penguin that the capitalism.
I'm saying, I mean, now
after a crisis.
I mean, I think that the pandemic has made such invasive dents into the ways that we live, into the ways that we communicate, into the ways that we live, that it's like we say, did you ask for a new world? Here you are. This is a very new world.
Okay.
And I'm saying it has dramatically changed personal relations.
Of course,
socialization. Yes. I mean, and we have to realize
we have this situation. We're trying to get something real. We just see only black.
But it's I'm saying I think we don't have the full perspective yet of what this is.
Okay.
I think it's gonna take some time, and then we're like it's like they had this on the Dutch newspaper last week. I mean, on this online newspaper, they had this video of a nightclub in Berlin.
Okay.
And so this says that finally people went back to clubs in Berlin. And so you look at this picture, like this pathetic club with all these people super bored, trying to dance, like half drink, and you're saying, this is what we want to go back to? I'm saying like, okay. Or like, do we want to go back to theme parks? Do we want to go back to Disneyland? You want to go to, I mean, people will, okay, we're so excited to go back to Euro Disney. Really? Okay. And so all these relations are shifting. And the world is changing, the world has changed, and we're still trying to catch up. I think that there have been very few instances in which the world, was broken in such a way. I'm saying, like, the fact that people could not live together, it means that we don't have a war. We live in a planet, but we don't have a war. And I'm saying maybe it happened like 3 or 4 times in history. So now we're trying to stitch the pieces together and say, okay, we still live in a world, and it's going to be okay. It's not going to be okay in that sense of going back to normal. I mean, there are people going back to normal. I mean, the rich are very much back to normal. They are in Cap du Ferrat, they are in Saint-Tropez, they are in Tuscany, they are in Mykonos. But even for them, the scale of things has changed in the sense of they inherited money. It's not the same today that it was 20 years ago.
Okay.
I think the inherited money is more limited. Like you actually have to work it for it to last. I mean, and the era of these grand fortunes that were built on steel, on coal, on metallurgics, this will not go. You have to find something else. Then somebody says, okay, you have to invest in Bitcoin. And no. It seems like it's like a placebo.
Okay.
It's like a temporary solution to something which is extremely big. I mean, the bottom line is that the human condition is endangered.
Okay.
Like the condition of living on Earth. And then there is this solution of like, okay, let's do the terraformation of Mars. And I'm not so sure that, I'm not so sure it's even possible. But even if it were possible, it wouldn't be the human condition. I'm not saying that the human condition is that good, but we don't seem to have much else to work on.
you have an intuition about the change of our life in a psychological level. You have also this psychological and also sociological level. What is the change of our way to life?
I
Or why to
suppose that
socialize?
I would suppose that our relationships are less, but better.
Okay, so explain me with
I'm
what.
saying like I think we're now living in a situation in which we have less relationships, like we are less interconnected to each other than it used to be. But I'm saying like this. I mean, it's something that is unthinkable in a time as brutal as this. But actually, friendship has become such an important thing for a lot of people. The ability to meet with friends. I would say that not all the consequences of the pandemic are bad, because then there was like I mean, who was this? Was it Brian Eno? No, it was Jazz was a British rocker who was saying, I mean, he was writing on this BBC article at some point last year. He was saying the problem with the quarantine, it's not the quarantine, it's that we were already in quarantine for a long time.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
and we were in quarantine for so long, but now when it became so transparent that, okay, this is the quarantine, it became so scary. He was saying we have been living like this for years.
Yeah.
Like this thing of like I mean, like living in London, the city of dreams, but then it's like you finish work at 11 p.m. So you get on the tube, you buy Chinese food, and then you sit in front of the TV. You know, I mean, you can do this in Chia as well.
Yeah. Okay.
You can do it. You can do it in Izmir. You don't have to pay 2,000 quid rent in London.
I have the impression that you have something like hope about the humanity of the closer relationship after the pandemic.
No, I mean, I know it's hard to believe, but I have hope. or I say like not infinite hope. I mean, I have a limited amount of hope. But I think generally it's anchored in unanswered questions, and by unanswered questions I mean like when in the 80s, when the whole idea of postmodernity just, I mean, after Foucault and so on.
Yeah.
And also in architecture, in art theory, these modern people, they are so boring. They couldn't figure out anything. I just say, okay, this is done, and now we're going to do something else. And actually, I have to say that I mean, intellectually speaking, one of the challenges for us in looking in retrospective, like how we got here, is that many of the questions, I'm not even talking about the questions of structuralism, I'm talking about many of the very fundamental questions of aesthetics, of ethics, of philosophy of science, of epistemology of the early 20th century are not answered. And these questions are so valuably important that what you say, I'm saying like we had a 100-year long party. Again, like this is like we're gonna pollute, and we're gonna use lots of concrete and lots of steel and lots of glass, and then you build these things, and then there is this climate change thing, and these structures are not livable, and you're like, wow, how did we get here? Hey, let's crawl back.
Okay.
And I'm not saying that this is calling about a return to the past, but it's more about like to articulate the future in a more sincere way. So things like, I mean, we did this thing, it didn't work. Maybe we should try something else.
You left me a lot of questions. I think we need to talk more about that. I really ask to you if you have some questions or interventions, or perhaps your comments about that. If not, we are going to take a beer and talking more about this interesting approach.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any questions, comments, reactions, something like that? Okay, seems it's time to go to take a beer. Okay. Go.
La pusieron en el chat. ¿La leo?
Ay, sí, léela, por favor.
Dice, do you think maybe a quarantine has something to do with manifestations?
I mean, there is that possibility. And I'm saying, like, when you talk about countries with authoritarian tendencies or fully blown authoritarian regimes, like in Turkey, it's like you are like, okay, there is March 2020. So it's like you're going to full quarantine, guys. There is no bars, there's no nothing. Everybody's gonna die. You're all gonna die, and people are actually dying. We don't have a vaccine. But then in June last year, I mean, there was no vaccine.
Yeah, okay.
There was still no vaccine. People were still dying, and the Turkish government was like, "Okay, guys, you go to the beach. Now you go to bars because you cannot keep these people at home with no job, with no money, in 30 degrees." I mean, they will flock into the streets and destroy the country. And so there is there is no government that can withstand this pressure. And I think this applies actually
But
to
our
every
government,
country. This happened in every country. They understood, okay, there is this limit of 3-4 months that people can sit and eat nothing and earn nothing and just be on the internet. And after some point, they are gonna blow up everything. And I'm saying, and this possibility is there, but I think that the danger is twofold, because okay, so it's dangerous for these political institutions as well, but it's also dangerous for us in the sense, okay, we're going to the streets and we're going to destroy the country. Actually, we don't have much else. So it's a dangerous gamble, but I believe that there is a very, very close relationship between the pandemic closures and quarantine and protest movements. And I think that this isn't only about the pandemic. This is a template for future climate change related uprisings.
Okay, thank you so much. Another questions?
All right.
All right. So, okay. It's time to go to take a wine or continue to talk. Thank you so much for your time, for your conversation. Really interesting. I need to talk more about this development. Y ustedes, muchísimas gracias por estar aquí. En el grupo están los videos correspondientes a los elementos teóricos que teníamos programados para hoy, pero quería aprovechar that Ari Cole be with us today, and I upload to you the videos about the theory component of the today lesson. Perhaps you have a final questions. Okay, thank you so much. Y nos vemos entonces el próximo jueves. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Ay, perdón, que no puedo leer porque espérate, a ver. Es que esto de un iPad es terrible. Vamos a ver si hay preguntas finales. No, mierda, qué horror con esta cosa. Ah, que ya está. Chatear a ver si tenemos preguntas aquí. Okay. Thank you so much. See you
Thank you,
next week.
gracias.
Gracias, profe. Hasta luego.
Gracias.
A ustedes. Chao, chao.